Today, we're jumping into one of the most brutal and complicated conflicts of the 20th century, the Spanish Civil War. Now, this wasn't just a war for Spain. It was really a battleground for the huge ideologies that were tearing the world apart. We're talking fascism, communism, democracy, all clashing in a conflict that was, in many ways, a terrifying preview of World War II.
Okay, so let's get right to it. The war doesn't kick off with some foreign invasion. No, this starts from the inside out. On July 17, 1936, Spain's own elite fighting force, the Army of Africa, stationed over in Morocco, literally turns its weapons against the very government it was supposed to be protecting.
And then, boom, the very next day, a general you've probably heard of, Francisco Franco, boards this little plane called the Dragon Rapé. He flies from the Canary Islands to take charge of the rebellion. And just like that, within hours, military bases all across mainland Spain start joining the revolt. Their goal? A super-fast, decisive military coup. They thought they could topple the government in just a few days.
That is the million-dollar question, right? How does a country's own army just decide to overthrow its government? To really get it, we've got to rewind and look at the incredibly turbulent years that pushed Spain right to this breaking point. You know, the cracks in the nation's foundation had been getting wider and wider for a long, long time.
So here's our game plan for breaking this all down. First, we're going to look at what divided the Republic in the first place. Then we'll see how this failed coup just spiraled into a full-blown war. After that, we'll cover the international players who got involved. And finally, we'll see how the Nationalists pulled off the win.
All right, let's start at the beginning. How did Spain get so polarized? Well, the answer is really in those 5 crazy years of the Second Republic, a time of such intense political whiplash that it basically drove the country right over a cliff.
So let's just walk through this timeline, because it's wild. In 1931, Spain gets rid of its king and becomes a republic. The first couple of years, they're run by left-wing reformers who go hard after the power of the Catholic Church and the big landowners. Then the pendulum swings, and a right-wing government gets in and just undoes all of it. This political seesaw leads to this incredibly violent miners' strike in 1934, which, by the way, is crushed by the army under, you guessed it, General Franco. So by the time a left-wing coalition barely wins the 1936 election, the whole situation is just a powder keg waiting for a spark.
By 1936, there was just no middle ground left in Spain. None. The streets literally became battlegrounds for groups like the Falange, that was Spain's fascist party, and communist militants. The whole country was paralyzed by strikes, churches were being burned down, and the political rhetoric got so violent. You had the far left openly calling for a revolution, and the far right was absolutely terrified of a Soviet-style takeover. I mean, democracy was basically on life support. And this is the moment it all goes off the rails. As payback for the killing of a socialist police lieutenant, government security forces kidnap and then murder José Calvo Sotelo, who was one of the most important right-wing leaders in the country. This single act just vaporized any last bit of hesitation among the generals who were plotting the coup. This was the final spark that convinced even a hesitant General Franco to go all in.
So the plan was simple, a quick, clean takeover in just a few days. But that is not even close to what happened. When the initial chaos settled, Spain hadn't been conquered. It had been shattered right down the middle. Yeah, the coup just didn't work. In the big cities, especially Madrid and Barcelona, security forces who stayed loyal to the government and, just regular armed citizens, they actually fought back and they won. The swift takeover failed spectacularly, and Spain was ripped in two, which set the stage for a horrifying 3-year-long civil war.
And what's so fascinating is when you look at the two sides, it's not simple at all. The Republicans, or Loyalists, they weren't one unified group. They were this messy alliance of liberals, socialists, communists, and even anarchists, and they all had totally different ideas for what Spain should be. And on the other side, the Nationalists, they had brought together army generals, conservatives, people who wanted the king back, and fascists. The one thing they all had in common, they hated the Republic and wanted to bring back a traditional Catholic Spain.
Right from the jump, this was a war of unbelievable brutality. One of the top nationalist generals, Mola, actually ordered his troops to use, and I'm quoting here, as much violence as is necessary. But the horror wasn't just on one side. In the areas the Republicans held, militias went after the clergy, killing thousands of priests and nuns. In this new world, you weren't just a political opponent anymore, you were an enemy that needed to be wiped out. The total number of people killed is estimated to be around 500,000.
500,000 people. And what's really staggering, what's so hard to wrap your head around, is that nearly as many people were killed behind the lines, from political executions, mob justice, personal revenge, as were killed on the actual battlefields.
Now, a brutal conflict like this doesn't just happen in a bubble. All of this violence, this massive clash of ideologies, it quickly grabbed the world's attention. And before you knew it, Spain had become the stage for a much, much bigger fight.
So was Spain fighting alone? Well, on paper, yeah. Britain and France, they pushed for this thing called a non-intervention agreement, and a bunch of countries signed it. But in reality, it was a total joke from day one.
This table really shows you what was actually going on. You had Hitler and Mussolini who saw Spain as this perfect opportunity to test out their new armies, maybe gain an ally, and spread fascism. So they sent Franco planes, tanks, and tens of thousands of troops. The Republic's main support came from Stalin's Soviet Union, which saw a chance to fight fascism, but they made Spain pay for it with its entire national gold reserve. And then you had the international brigades, thousands of volunteers from all over the world who just showed up to fight for the Republic.
Spain literally became a testing ground, a laboratory, for the weapons and the horrifying tactics that were about to be used in World War II. The absolutely brutal aerial bombing of the Basque town of Guernica by Germany's Condor Legion. It was a terrifying preview of the kind of total war, of targeting civilians, that was about to be unleashed across the whole continent. So, with all that going on, how did the Nationalists end up winning? Well, it wasn't just one single thing. It was really a combination of being way better organized under a single leader, Franco, and having a constant, reliable flow of better weapons and support from Germany and Italy. Let's look at how the war turned. So after they failed to capture Madrid right at the start, Franco completely changed his strategy. He started this slow, methodical, grinding conquest. In 1937, he takes the industrial north. In 1938, his army smashed through to the Mediterranean Sea, literally cutting the Republic's territory in half. The Republic's last desperate gamble was this huge offensive at the Battle of the Ebro, but it was an absolute disaster that just shattered what was left of their army. And while the Nationalists were all united under Franco, the Republican side was literally fighting itself. The Communists, who were taking orders from Moscow, were all about win the war first. But the anarchists and other revolutionaries, they believed the war was the revolution. This massive disagreement actually exploded into open street fighting between the two groups in Barcelona in 1937. It was a civil war inside the civil war, and it just completely crippled their ability to fight Franco. And you can see it right here in the numbers. By the end of 1938, the Nationalists had this huge advantage in planes, in artillery, in everything. That steady stream of high-quality German and Italian military gear was just too much for the exhausted and divided Republican forces to handle. With the Republican army basically destroyed after the Battle of the Ebro, the end came really fast. In January of '39, Barcelona fell, barely putting up a fight, and then 2 months later, Madrid, the city that had held out heroically for almost 3 years, finally surrendered. On April 1, 1939, General Franco signed the very last war report. The Spanish Civil War was officially over. But this wasn't the start of peace, not by a long shot. It was the beginning of a brutal dictatorship that would control Spain for nearly 40 years, right up until Franco died in 1975. So what do you do with a history like that? The legacy of the Spanish Civil War is incredibly long and painful. I mean, even today, Spain is still trying to figure out how to deal with the memory of the war and the decades of dictatorship that came after. You still have these fierce debates about historical memory, about what to do with the hundreds of thousands of victims still buried in unmarked mass graves. It's just a powerful reminder of how the echoes of a civil war can last for generations.